Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Student Loan Planner podcast. I kind of sound like a frog today for reasons of the past few weeks being very challenging. I'll talk about that later in today's show. So I hope you tolerate my Kermit the Frog voice. So let's talk about cancellation, IDR, and challenges to a lot of the student loan relief President Biden is trying to get through the door right now. So there was a report this past week about potential lawsuits that the GOP and related groups are trying to file against student loan cancellation that President Biden's trying to do. Now, this is really a pretty fascinating development because the PSLF waiver, the IDR waiver, both of those two plans were slated to cost over $100 billion, and nobody challenged them legally. So people complained about them. People said mean things about them on Twitter, but then people started getting their loans discharged. So is this going to be similar with student loan cancellation, where you're going to see a lot of complaining on Twitter and then to actually see those plans actually come to fruition? Or is this something that's serious enough and it's going to motivate the GOP opposition enough for them to take a lot of effort to block these things? So let's talk about cancellation first. Um, the good news about people that are hearing about the IDR plan, the income driven repayment plan, is the IDR plan's very difficult to challenge legally, maybe even impossible to challenge legally. But it is possible that that IDR plan could be thrown out if Republicans win the White House in 2024. So we'll talk about that, what that means for you. This IDR plan is a lot more relevant to most of the people in our audience that have, six-figure student loan debts, right? 10, even 20,000 of cancellation is not a game changer for the majority of people in our audience because most people who listen to this podcast have larger than average student loan debts, right? So let's talk about cancellation first, and then we'll make some comments about IDR. Cancellation is predicated on something called the HEROES Act of 2003. So the HEROES Act of 2003 is the same law that President Trump used to pause payments and interest after Congress had finished authorizing that pause under the CARES Act. So this HEROES Act says that there has to be a national emergency declaration and that the Secretary of Education can take actions to make sure that borrowers are no worse off due to this national emergency declaration. So what's really kind of I don't want to use the word hilarious, but it is a little hilarious because if you look at the press releases from Department of Education, they are using so many lawyerly terms. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell based off of knowing what's in the HEROES Act that every press release they talk about is talking about how we want to make sure borrowers are no worse off due to this pandemic national emergency. Like it's like, why would you say this? Like from an English perspective, like it's just kind of weird. Wouldn't you be like, yay, cancellation for everybody? But they're not saying that. They're also calling it targeted cancellation when it's cancellation for 98%, 97% of borrowers. Again, they're saying that specifically because of the law that they're trying to use. The law that they're trying to use has to be because of a national pandemic emergency or national emergency declaration. They have to make sure borrowers are no worse off, so they're using those words in the declaration. So it's very much clear to me that their legal experts were the ones guiding the rollout of the cancellation announcement, trying to make sure that it survives a legal challenge. Now, another interesting kind of thread on Twitter was this Fordham law professor that sort of said that this was his words. He's like, I don't know why they're choosing this act to base the cancellation off of, because the Higher Education Act, in his opinion, saying that the Secretary of Education can waive, modify the terms of loans is more powerful and would be more robust in his view to a legal challenge than this would be. So some of the people on Twitter, some of the legal experts on Twitter were saying that if this actually does get challenged in court, especially with today's 6-3 conservative Supreme Court majority, that he would see it going down 6-3 or even more than 6-3 because of just how shaky the legal logic is behind the way they did cancellation. I tend to think what most student loan experts think on this, which is that if this lawsuit happens, like if they're able to get this lawsuit credibly in front of a judge that rules against it and puts an injunction on it, it's very likely this cancellation is not going to happen because it's going to get appealed to the Supreme Court and they're going to rule against it. Now, if you're a fan of the student loan pause, that would probably actually be a good thing for you. And the reason is I would feel fairly confident that if this cancellation were to get struck down, the final student loan pause expiring December 31st President Biden would probably try to push that until July of 2023 when his new income-based repayment plan rolls out. So that is the big mess that I think we're about to experience is Republicans are going to try to vigorously oppose this cancellation, and the result might be an even more aggressive IDR plan than what they're even talking about. I don't know yet. We'll see. As well as an extension of the student loan pause if Biden doesn't get his way. This is kind of the student loan stuff that they're doing with the administration is very kind of consistent with the more aggressive, sort of more sort of fighting stance the Biden administration has adopted in the past couple months, right? It's a real kind of difference in the way he's sort of speaking and doing policy. And it's I think also very strategic by Biden, right? Biden wants to win a second term. I think pretty much anybody who's president would want to win a second term, and he's had a hard time getting his base to back him. And this is a very strongly supported move in the progressive wing. And if Trump is the nominee in 2024, Biden's got the best uh, argument as to why it should be him. He can say truthfully, "I'm the only person that beat Trump. That's why you should nominate me again for a second term. We're going to make sure that my vice president is somebody you like and trust in case something happens to me because of my age." So I think this was also about sort of coalescing the Democratic Party around President Biden and very strategic, very political. Now, one thing that you'll notice on Twitter too is I would say most economists, except for sort of the very left wing economists, right? Like Krugman, those kind of folks that are very sort of known for their progressivism. Most economists were pretty against this cancellation. Why is that? Mostly because it doesn't do anything to fix any of the problems. And when you talk about redistributing resources, one of the people who's a centrist economist in the Obama administration, I believe his name's Jason Furman, said that, this was not a bill that redistributes wealth from the wealthiest to student loan borrowers. This was something that redistributes wealth from everybody to student loan borrowers in the form of higher inflation that's expected to be 0.2% higher. Now, you might say that that's not that big of a deal. Goldman Sachs called cancellation an economic nothing burger because, maybe it's just not that big of a deal to raise everybody's costs by $100 to get real meaningful relief to a lot of people out there that need it. So the jury's still out as to what's going to happen in terms of people's views of student loan cancellation politically. It probably doesn't matter a whole lot because people tend to not vote on things like student loan cancellation. They tend to vote on things like, immigration or abortion or the economy, right? Those are just more animating factors. Now, with the lawsuits that they're talking about, the lawsuits that the GOP groups are trying to get going have a big obstacle to them, and that is you have to have standing to sue. What that means is you have to have a party who is injured by a decision to then bring a lawsuit. So that's pretty difficult because the question is who's made worse off by student loan cancellation? And the actual surprising answer is a lot of people are made worse off, but would any of them sue? So the primary people that are made worse off also have an incentive to not sue. So let's look at some of these options. So student loan servicers, they're losing overnight, theoretically, 50 to 60% of their customers and therefore 50 to 60% of their revenue. That's a pretty good argument that you are being negatively impacted by this decision to cancel student loan debt, and therefore you could sue. But they probably won't sue. And why is that? So, most people whose loans are wiped out again, a lot of these people will be current students. And if your loans are wiped out again, are you going to take additional loans while you're in school? Yes. So, say you have 20 million people whose loans are wiped out, probably 10 million of those people would become borrowers again overnight. For basically the next semester, they'd become borrowers again. And so all that revenue, because they're paid sort of flat fees per borrower, all that revenue would come back. So maybe you lose half of your revenue, but you only lose, 25% of it once they account for all those people who borrow again that are still in school right now. So you've lost 25% of your revenue. Would you still sue? Well, here's another problem. They're negotiating with the Department of Education over the next round of servicer contracts so they have more revenue in the future to look forward to if they don't piss off Department of Education so much by suing them. So if you've got a big stream of cash flow that you have not yet been promised, a lot of these servicers are going to say, well, I would like to get that revenue. And so therefore, I'm not going to put up a fight with this because I want to get the next pot of money. And then the other issue with the servicer suing is actually a minority of their revenue is student loan servicing. most of these servicers like Nelnet, they might make a quarter of their revenue on student loan servicing, and the other stuff is things like private loans or student loan refinancing or FFEL loan portfolios. So there would be a huge brand risk to sue over this. Imagine US, United States versus Nelnet, and that's the decision that blocks student loan cancellation for 20 million people. That would be a very negative headline, as about as negative as it gets. So, you would look at that if you're a current student loan servicer and think this is probably not worth it. Now, what about states? This is a little bit tougher because how would a state prove that they're negatively impacted by this decision? But if you want to be super weird, you could say that one of the states like Arkansas or Mississippi that tax student loan forgiveness might argue that some of their residents are being taxed against their will because of an unconstitutional federal government decision. Now, that would be kind of a stretch, I think. But if you are really opposed to this, if you're in a place like Arkansas and you're desperately searching for somebody that has standing to sue, they're going to figure out a way, possibly, that try to at least throw something at the wall and see if it sticks. So one example would be a very conservative med student who doesn't mind, renting their name out for a lawsuit, that would be a disaster if you were the person whose last name blocked student loan forgiveness. You're going to get a lot of hate mail. But what I would expect would be that it's a med student going for PSLF who 10K of cancellation is irrelevant for, but their income's already on file with FAFSA, so it would be automatic. And so that person, because they're going to get taxed for $500 for 10,000 of irrelevant student loan cancellation, that they decide to rent their name out for a lawsuit against this cancellation decision because of a few $100 income tax bill. Now that's unlikely, but all it takes is one person that some, probably conservatively appointed judge decides that they're standing for this lawsuit to advance. And again, once it advances, once it happens, once there's a lawsuit that does result in an injunction, I do think that cancellation would be in big jeopardy. But the issue is it's a big if as to whether or not we're going to see a court case that's taken up because of the standing problem. Now, what about FFEL loan holders? This is that group of investors that owns the commercially held FFEL debt that wasn't eligible for the interest pause during the pandemic. So I think that these groups bought up guaranteed interest income from the government, and having all of their loans forgiven would give them their capital back, but it would impair their investment and they would not be getting their future interest income. Now, you might say, well, prepayments are already baked into their contracts because they have FFEL loans that can be consolidated. That's maybe true, but if you're having a direct incentive to cancel it, or if you're trying to cancel it directly, right, then those individuals would be more motivated to sue. And again, it only would take one investor that's very conservative, very opposed to this decision, to be motivated to sue to create a potential court case. There are companies out there, such as Navient, for example, which, according to their disclosures, about 37% of their revenue was interest income from Ffel loans. That's a lot. So if you're talking about impairing that stream of revenue, now it's true that the majority of the revenue does not come from Ffel loans, and the flip side to that is they're not a student loan servicer anymore. So they also don't have a super big incentive to care about what the Department of Education thinks of them. Although you could also say on the flip side, yes, they do, because they like to issue private loans for people that are in school. And could Department of Education, decertify them or something if they were pissed off that they stopped student loan cancellation? So, I think that the most likely source of a lawsuit against this, in my guess, would be a minor investor in FFEL owned loans whose investment is impaired. So, this would probably not be a major company. This would probably be some small group, right? That is probably steered by GOP groups to file lawsuits. So, think about like some, super conservative pension fund that owns FFEL loans, something like that. Don't worry, none of my sort of speculation is going to increase the risk of a lawsuit because GOP groups with armies of lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, are actively searching for someone to figure out how to sue against this. But I would also not be too worried at the moment because people, have said that the PSLF waiver and the IDR waiver were legal too, and then they just got implemented without anybody stopping them. So the only difference is cancellation is a much bigger deal. It's a much bigger bill. It's a lot more expensive. So it's drawing a lot more attention. If I had to put a percentage on it, I would sort of guess that maybe 60% chance that cancellation happens as is. maybe a 40% chance that it gets blocked legally. So we talked about cancellation quite a bit, but what's more relevant to our audience is the IDR plan. IDR is just happening through negotiated rulemaking. If you think about the dials that the Biden administration decided to turn on this, it's really extraordinary. The initial proposal of the Department of Education for this new IDR plan was pretty modest. They just wanted to allow undergrads to pay a little bit less, and they also wanted undergrads only to have access to this plan. But then the negotiated rulemaking happened, and pretty much all of the rulemaking committee members, on that committee were very opposed to not going really big on this IDR plan. They wanted to do, in some cases, 400% of the poverty line, wanted to cancel debt every year, wanted there to be no interest, wanted people to be able to pay a very low amount of their income, wanted to forgive debt after 7 years. I mean, some of the asks of people on the committee were essentially them asking for them to cancel all student loan debt, but just through the IDR plan instead because they felt like they could. Now, this IDR plan is a really big deal. We don't yet know what they're going to call it. We're calling it Biden IDR for the moment. Now, this thing is such a big deal for a couple reasons. One thing that it does is it changes the poverty line deduction from 150% of income to 225% of income. So, 225% of income is going to substantially increase the amount of income that you can earn before having to pay anything in your student loans. So, for a family of four, your deduction goes from 41,000 to 62,000. For a single person, your deduction goes from 20,000 to 30,000. Your payment, if you're just undergrad debt only, drops in half. It goes from 10% of income to 5% of income. But you have to take into account both of these things to figure out what the payment really is. So it's not just that they dropped the payment in half, and it's not just they increased the poverty line, they did both. So for example, if you have an $80,000 income as a family of four, before this plan came out, you get a deduction of 40,000, you're paying 10% on the remainder of that income above the 150% of the poverty line. So you'll pay 10% on 40 grand, it's 4,000 a year, roughly 300 something a month. And your payment, if you have an average debt of 37,000, you'll pay that off. But with this new plan, you get a deduction of 60,000, you'd pay 5% on 20,000 of that income above the 225 of the poverty line. And so that's 1,000 a year instead of 4,000. So if you pay 1,000 a year over 20 years, you could even basically pay net present value of like 15,000. So if you borrow 37, you're now better off going for forgiveness instead of refinancing it or paying it back. And that's a sea change. That's incredible difference of the way that we pay for, education in America. And it now provides absolutely zero incentive not to borrow the absolute maximum possible for undergraduate. So the new plan, even for somebody making an average salary after graduation of 55K with a $37,000 average debt, it used to be that you just had to pay that back. It's a car payment, pay it back over 10 years. This new plan is totally different. So another scenario here, if you have a family of five earning 80,000, so that's a one earner family with a spouse and no taxable income and three kids. The repay plan is 261 a month. The new plan is 29 a month. Even if you had 100K income, it'd be 112 a month in the new plan. Now, even if this family of five earned 120K a year, you could still get forgiveness because you can max out your 401K and get it close to that 100 a month number. So again, in terms of present value, you're probably paying back, 15 grand if you're making about 120K and maxing your 401K. Now, one of the big questions I've got on this new plan is how are they going to treat spousal income? If it's like pay as you earn, you could file separate, right? It depends on how they treat it. Are they going to treat it like pay where you can file joint or separate? Or are they going to treat it like repay where you have to file joint no matter what? If they treat it like pay, you could have, two earners making 120K each, and you could get forgiveness on 30K of debt. So think about the incentives there. Two people married to each other making 120K, you file separate, you max out your 401K. A family making 240,000 a year could get forgiveness on 30,000 of undergrad debt. Now that's extraordinary. Now the question is will they do repay treatment of this new plan and slow down the forgiveness a little bit? Now the third big component of this IDR plan is the zero interest. It's a really big deal. So imagine you're a resident physician. If you do the math under this new plan, your payment's about 1,500 a year. Now your interest is probably 12,000 to 20,000 a year on your med school debt, and under existing plans, the remaining interest with the repay plan would be 50% of it would be covered. On the paid plan, none of it's covered, but it just adds on to your balance with simple interest. But your new interest subsidy on this Biden IDR plan works the following way. You pay your required payment, which does go to interest, and then the remaining interest is all subsidized. So if your required payment is 1,500 and the remaining interest is 10,000, then they cover all the remaining 10,000, and your effective interest rate is, 1,500 divided by 200,000, for example. So, in most cases, during a residency or fellowship program, your new effective interest rate on this new Biden IDR plan would be as low as 0.5 to 2% in most cases. That's actually lower than what undergrads pay for subsidized Stafford loans. Now, this is going to benefit the highest income earners the most. Why is that? It's because people going for forgiveness don't really need to care about how big their balance is. Even if you have to pay a tax bomb, it's really not that impactful to have that balance increase. So, this interest subsidy is really only helpful if you eventually pay off your debt. So, if you think about the fact that the more you borrow, the more your subsidy is, and the more you borrow, typically the more you earn, not always, but usually the highest balances are among physicians, dentists, lawyers, right? And you might have a very high balance for somebody that's a social worker, but that person was going for forgiveness anyway. So the subsidy for that person is less relevant since they were going to pursue PSLF probably anyway. So the interesting point there is that, this new IDR plan, the subsidies really go to three different groups. And, the three different groups are people who make, less than 150,000 that have undergrad loans, um, but more than 50, because if you were making less than 50, you probably were in a good position to maybe go for forgiveness anyway. You might say maybe like 30 or 40K might be the cutoff there. So like 40K to 150K income earners. So the sort of middle class and upper middle class for that have only undergrad debt. And then people with large family sizes. So if you have if you have 6 kids, this plan's awesome. You're going to pay almost nothing on your student loans because your, percent of the poverty line went way up. And then the third big beneficiary is people that are eventually going to pay off their loans that are high income earners with high debt amounts. Now, that's actually a point for grad students at least. That's a point for refinancing because it's going to hold down your balance, and so it's going to make it easier to decide to pay down your loans. Now, for the grad loan people, the payment percent is 10%, by the way. It's not 5. So there's a little bit of a confusion. Oh, am I going to be able to pay 5% of my income? No, you won't. It's going to be 10% of your income. If you have undergrad debt, then it's the weighted average. So if you have, 30,000 of undergrad loans and 300,000 of loans from dental school, you'll have zero point 0.9 times 10% plus zero point 0.1 times 5%. So your new percent of your income would be like 9.5%. And then the other big change is the poverty line. So your deduction on the poverty line would go from 150% of income to 225% of income. So maybe your payment net would drop 100 to 300 a month. Now, would that make a difference on going for forgiveness around the margins? Not really. So you would actually the interesting part of this new Biden IDR plan is very few people would actually be affected in that that have graduate degrees on whether or not you should go for forgiveness or refinancing. In fact, some people might be tempted to go for refinancing because your balance would be, no longer growing and negatively amortizing, which means you might want to throw money at your loans and watch it go down. I think that the interest subsidy will work the same way the repay subsidy does, which is if you're getting an interest subsidy, once they calculate it for the next 12 months, you're going to get that regardless of prepayments that you make. So people will be able to literally throw money at their loans and watch their balance decline. Now the problem is what's going to happen is once your required payment on this new Biden IDR plan is high enough that it does cover your interest subsidy now is zero, right? So it's just the remaining interest that your required payment doesn't cover. And so once your required payment is big enough, you're no longer covering your interest, and you probably need to refinance. So kind of a good rule of thumb for this might be, just take 5% of your balance. And if 5% of your balance is your monthly payment, then you might be and actually I should say maybe let's rephrase that. Maybe it's 0.5%. Yeah. 0.5% of your balance, if that's your monthly payment, you probably would want to think about refinancing. So for example, if you have 200,000 of loans and 0.5% of that's $1,000 a month. So if your payment is 1,000 a month, your required payment is probably covering your interest accrual in full. So it's, 6% of a 200,000 balance is 12,000 a year. So that would be a typical interest cost. And if your payment is 1,000 a month, that's 12,000 a year. Your required payments are fully covering all of your interest that would normally accrue. So your subsidy on this new Biden IDR plan would be zero. So we're in the process of creating some tools so you can see how this new plan works because it is very complicated, but it is very beneficial to most people. I think the biggest thing that we're going to see change is income driven repayment will probably become the most common repayment plan, and income driven repayment is going to become more common than paying back your loans with this new plan. So right now 9 million borrowers pursue income driven repayment. I could see that number double or triple even, and that could become 20 or even, almost 30 million people might end up pursuing income driven repayment at some point. Now, if you think about the fact that cancellation, if it does go through, would wipe out a lot of these small debt balances, which are not as good cases for income driven repayment, it'll be like 75% of people that are still in the student loan program might be using income driven repayment, which is going to just create a huge constituency that's going to demand ever lower payments, going to demand more generous forgiveness terms. It's going to demand no taxes on forgiven debt. And I think that's the whole strategy here is the Democrats believe that higher education should be free, and they are dialing this lever to the maximum of the income driven repayment plans to try to achieve this via executive order because they can't pass it through legislation because their party does not agree. That's really the reason why Biden went the executive order route with all of this is because if you look at the responses from moderate senators running for reelection in Nevada, in New Hampshire, in Ohio, for someone who's trying to overtake JD Vance there. If you look at all these different places, Colorado, a lot of these more moderate Democratic senators and senators running in more purple states said that they don't support this because they think that there's better ways to address higher education, and they're concerned that that's going to not be popular among the working class voters that they need to attract to be able to win in states like that. And so that's why you have an executive order on this instead of legislation, because if you did it via legislation, there would be no question marks, right? If you did it via legislation, it would be more permanent. If you did it via legislation, you wouldn't have to worry about a Republican winning the White House and overturning a lot of this stuff in 2024. The reality, I think, is with this income driven repayment plan becoming so generous, I do think that if a Republican wins in 2024, one of their first things they'll do in the Department of Education is set up a negotiated rulemaking committee specifically to eliminate this new income driven repayment plan. Now, historically, the Department of Ed has been unwilling to take away plans that people are currently in. So if they did take it away, the worst case scenario would be a Republican takes office in January 2025, and then they do negotiated rulemaking, come out with the rule by November 2025, and then it would be implemented no sooner than July of 2026. So at a minimum, you would have 3 years of this new plan to get onto it, and then presumably you would not be able to have that taken away from you. Now, again, if the Republicans don't win in 2024, by the time that they would have an opportunity to eliminate this plan in 2029, this plan is probably too baked in and too deeply implemented into the fabric of higher education for there to be an opportunity to get rid of it. So we're really, I think, going through a period of very high instability in higher education policy, where both parties have sort of just decided, well, instead of compromising, we're just going to do it our way. And that's going to bring a lot of help to borrowers if the Democratic plan does remain unchallenged and gets through. It's going to result in all people saving a lot of money that have student loans, and presumably people are going to react to these incentives, and so will the schools. Schools are the ones that are going to react the fastest because if you're a school that's proud of having a moderate cost, there's no incentive to have a moderate cost anymore. If you're going to put somebody in 15 or 20K of student loan debt, it might as well be 40 because the costs to the borrower are the exact same. And this is what graduate programs have done already by jacking their tuition up enormously. because they know that, hey, if I'm USC Dental School and the price for a dental student is going to be 10% of their income, it doesn't matter if I charge them 200,000 for their degree or 500,000 for their degree. So we might as well capture that extra 300 grand of revenue and go build more buildings with it that are going to last us for 50 years. Because if the Department of Ed shuts off the gravy train, well, we've already built all these buildings and paid for them, and we're in great shape, and we've been able to milk this program for as much as it's worth. And that's really the real problem. The administration has just talked about putting schools on a watch list of those that produce graduates with high debt that they're not able to pay back. That's meaningless. That's just sort of, lip service, I think, as to doing this plan, because the other reality is they don't really have, I think, the authority to rein in a lot of these schools. Maybe they do. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that they don't have that executive authority to ban a lot of these schools from federal financial aid. And if they did, these schools might sue and imperil the whole thing. So I think that's why they're trying to do it this way. But that's the big problem with this executive action, is it does nothing at all to fix the real problem, which is out of control higher education costs. And if you look at other, countries that do income driven repayment plans, they typically put a mandated limit on what schools can charge. If you're going to get unlimited taxpayer help with no underwriting for helping students from all backgrounds get an education, then you've got to have some protections there and some regulation on the schools so that the schools can't charge whatever the heck they want, which is what the current system is. So this new IDR plan and this new cancellation is, in combination, is going to make it so that higher education tuition is going to be a runaway train after this. There's going to be no restrictions on them raising prices. And I have seen some podcasts talking about how these institutions are going to want to avoid big price increases for the next 12 months to avoid basically, creating an embarrassment, for the administration, and also just avoid kind of sticking out and getting them put onto this watch list. So there's some smart institutions that are going to game the system, avoid raising attention to themselves for this next year. But after this next year, we're off to the races as far as higher education tuition goes. It's just going to go way up. There's some New York Federal Reserve research that supports this. They basically find that for every $1,000 increase in the subsidized student loan limits, the schools raise their tuition by $600. So they don't capture 100% of the increase, but they capture the majority of it. So I expect that we'll probably see that, and that's fine. I just hope that everybody gets the word that, if this new plan does stick, this new IDR plan, then you need to borrow as much as you possibly can. There's no reason not to. And if you do need to end up paying it back, well, that's okay. You might need to have not paid it back. So that's fine. And if you have like, zero interest sort of line of credit on the remaining interest that your required payment doesn't cover, that's kind of free money. So even if you put it in a bank account, you're not supposed to do that. But even if you put it in a bank account, you'd come out ahead. So it's really kind of a wild west that we're going down. I do think in terms of us helping people, we'll probably be able to help people no matter what. Either they're going to use, the same rules as they will for repay, and you'll have to look at filing joint on that plan or doing separate with another one, or you'll have them let people file separately with this new plan. And we'll be having conversations with people that make six figures from undergrad that have 30K balances. Oh, did you know, by the way, that you could go for forgiveness? And that'll be millions of additional people that need to get optimized, filed separate, maxed, minimizing AGI type of conversations. So it is interesting from a perspective of our business. It seems like we'll be busy either way. But just remember too that this PSLF waiver is ending October 31st. Our appointments are filling out really quickly, you know, for the coming up on that deadline, uh, until the end of October. So if you are a public servant, definitely get a plan booked before that opportunity ends. And then the IDR waiver, I expect that they're probably trying to focus their attention on the PSLF waiver. And then maybe they'll come out with the IDR waiver FAQ sometime in late September or October. And then we'll be doing November, December, we'll be doing IDR waiver implementation stuff. And I think also what's going to impact things is they're waiting to see if they're going to win the midterms or not. If they do win the midterms, there's probably no rush on the IDR waiver ending, so they probably would extend that until July. And then, like I said, if I do think that if they don't get the cancellation challenged, I do think that the date is definitely December 31st because of the risk of the boy who cried wolf, right? If you say it's the final time a second time and go back on it, nobody's ever going to believe you again. But if they do get a court challenge, then they can just point to that court challenge and say, I know we said this was the last one, but we can't ask people to make payments while there's this open court challenge in place. So we're going to pause everything, until July because of this court challenge. So I do think that that's kind of the world we're living in right now. Um, so in terms of why do I sound like a frog? Why is Kermit talking to you right now? So I don't know if you maybe heard on the last emergency pod I did, but so we had um, you know, our first pregnancy was very normal. Second pregnancy, unexpectedly, my wife had to have an emergency C-section at 29 weeks. So I woke up in the middle of the night. Baby wasn't moving. We're panicking. We go to the hospital, emergency C-section, and seems like things are okay. Baby's in the NICU, and then baby had a bowel perforation, which is one of the highest fatality um, sort of things that a premature baby can get. So we got another call in the middle of the night. Um, Thought we were gonna lose him, and spent a lot of nights in the hospital, and had been through quite a journey. I'm happy to report that he is okay at the moment. We've got a long road ahead, and that's why I sound exhausted. That's why I'm so tired, and that's probably why I got a cold. Probably because my immune defenses were zero and shot because we've just been not sleeping well and just having a really hard time with just hoping that our son makes it. So, my out of office says paternity leave. It's sort of so it feels like more like purgatory leave, I guess, because you get excited about having a new child, but you're like terrified that you're not going to be able to bring him home. So right now it's looking good, knock on wood, that we will be able to bring him home. So I do very much appreciate all your thoughts, prayers, well wishes, and everything. Student loan stuff is a very nice distraction during this time. There's not a lot that I can do for him with him being in NICU, other than visit him. But we haven't even been able to visit him because I've had a cold for the past several days. So I would just say thank you to all the healthcare workers. Thank you. I think that, every little thing that you do is really a lot bigger of a deal than you realize. All the small mercies, the small, kindnesses you show families, I think we appreciate it more than you know. And I'm sure that you get a lot of people that are upset and being mean or hurting your feelings or just making you have a bad day when you have a bad patient interaction. One thing I'll say, and this is not to excuse any of that behavior, but like, you know, definitely this has been probably the most stressful experience of my life. And I think a lot of times people do and say things they shouldn't when they're at their wits' end about themselves, right? Um, I mean, it's kind of like I chalk it up to the kind of emails that we get in our inbox. Some of the emails are downright abusive occasionally. People say some pretty nasty things about us sometimes, and that's okay. And that's because I think that, there's just a ton of hurt when it comes to student loans, a ton of anguish. And we get a ton of really wonderful comments from people that we really appreciate. And so we just kind of are grateful for those positive interactions, and then we just chalk up the mean people to, man, they must be having a really bad day and this must have caused them a lot of pain, and we're just going to not take it personally and move on. So I don't know, this is a little bit of encouragement for the healthcare workers out there. I think a lot of them, like, I think my wife jokes, or some of them joke, the friends joke, that like they were the most loved people ever during COVID, and now everybody's forgot about them again. So if you're feeling not, um, not thanked, just know that I'm thanking you, um, on behalf of my family, my son. Thank you for what you do, even if it's not connected in any way to, pediatrics or something. It's just super important, and you do really have a big impact on people's lives. So that's why a lot of times over the coming couple months, I think you're going to see other consultants doing the newsletter. You're going to see other consultants doing the podcast. I'm going to jump in when I can. When I don't sound like Kermit, maybe I'll hope to come back and do some more podcasts. But I just wanted to share kind of what's going on in the business. That's why things maybe seem a little discombobulated. It's amazing that we've held everything together without me needing to be involved at all. That's really awesome. Couldn't have done that 2, 3 years ago. So thanks to all the team as well. all the people that you're talking to, the consultants, really are truly experts. And the funny thing is sometimes people request me, but it's like, you really shouldn't, because the consultants are the ones that do all the plans. That'd be like asking for the 75-year-old, head of surgery who does one case a month. I'm just kidding. But, versus the 40-year-old surgeon that's, 5 years out of fellowship, who's this super expert who does plans all the time. That's our consultants, folks. So you want them, not me. Thank you for everybody that just again has shared nice comments and nice words for us at this time, and definitely hope to share some good news in the coming weeks that we brought the baby home and that he's healthy. So that's certainly our focus right now. But thanks again for listening to today's show. Like I said, get a consult booked if you're one of those PSLF waiver cases before October 31st to make sure that you don't miss out. And then stay tuned on things like the IDR waiver and this new IDR plan, because we'll have a lot more for you on that. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.